cloud. All right, and I'm going to just full screen us. All right, so I am going to, everybody who watches this video series knows who I am. So I'm going to let you introduce yourself for a minute, Kevin, and then we'll start chatting.
Hi, I'm Kevin Lamoureux, and I teach at the University of Winnipeg. Previously, I had served as Associate Vice President, Indigenous Affairs at the University of Winnipeg, and I've also served as the Education Lead for the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation. My career is focused primarily on Indigenous education and reconciliation, but through my relationship with Dr. Cates, I've discovered that there's a beautiful parallel between the work that I'm doing and work in the area of inclusive education.
Awesome, thank you. So today we're going to just chat about the intersections between Indigenous education and universal design, about the concept of inclusion as being more than just kids with disabilities, that it is about how does a teacher teach in a classroom with 30 kids, each of whom are unique individuals and have multiple identities, culturally, religiously, sexual orientation, blah, 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 right? So our goal, you and I both, has always been about helping teachers to support the diverse needs of all learners. And part of reconciliation, in my mind, as a UDL person, it's that whole designed for some of benefit to all, is that what we do for Indigenous learners actually ends up benefiting non-Indigenous learners just as much, right? Because it's just good education, it's good practice. And so I think one of the things that happened in the whole history here is not just the harm that was done to Indigenous people. I think non-Indigenous people were harmed by not putting aside their egos and listening, because there are things we could learn from Indigenous people and Indigenous cultures that would have benefited all of us. So it's something that I'm really passionate about, that this is not about white people rescuing Indigenous people, or about, it's not a one-way street. This is very much, we have things to learn from Indigenous people have things to learn from us. There's an exchange here.
There's so much beautiful potential in what you've said, and it's so exciting to think about teachers being empowered with a brand new set of tools and a capacity to sort of reimagine business as usual in schools. And I love the possibility that reconciliation creates to sort of stand alongside that journey, right? To be a part of that journey of reimagining business as usual. But I have to be clear about what I mean when I say reconciliation for that to make sense, because that's one of those words that can mean many, many different things, right? There can be as many definitions of the word as there are people trying to define it. I also have to acknowledge, and this is something that I say publicly often, is that there are many fellow Indigenous people from the communities that I work with, who reject that word. And there's a lot of hurt that exists, and a lot of things that we've watched happen since we were given the final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission back on June 1st, 2015, things that have broken people's hearts. We've watched people who have murdered Indigenous people walk free from their crimes. We've watched the authorities point machine guns at Indigenous protesters attempting to protect their land and their water, things that are protected under the Canadian Constitution, right? And we've watched communities discover unmarked hidden graves behind their schools. And so I understand the hurt, but I still believe in reconciliation. And the reason I still believe in it, the reason why I still get enthusiastic about it, well, there's actually two things, Jennifer. The first is that I truly believe that we wouldn't have reconciliation. This concept wouldn't be a national discussion. Right? Even many of those unmarked hidden graves would have never been found if it hadn't been for the strength and the dignity and the courage of residential school survivors. Mm-hmm. And that's important to me because I stand in awe, as an Indigenous person myself, and maybe anyone watching this in the future can relate to the feeling of pride that comes from knowing that I come from people like that. You know, I
Yeah.
come from people who as children could have experienced all of this terror and hurt, some of the very worst that Canada's been guilty of. And yet they grew to be the kind of people that could extend their hand in friendship and offer this opportunity for reconciliation is incredible. What that
It
reminds me
is.
is that despite the challenges that exist, the intergenerational traumas that still stand in the way of the vibrancy of our children, that there is also intergenerational strength and love and dignity, and that's a part of the story as well. So that's the first thing about this crazy word reconciliation.
Okay.
And I don't believe that I get to call it off no matter how heartbroken I may be. And it is easy to feel very sad. It continues to be very dangerous to be Indigenous in Canada.
Yeah.
But the second thing that I believe to be true, and you hinted at this when you talked about the idea that, we, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, for over 140 years have been denied the opportunity to be in relationship with each other in a way that could have otherwise been possible, a way that would have allowed us to share and learn from
Mhm.
each other and take the best of two worlds and make something new and even better for our children. We've all been robbed of that, Indigenous and non-Indigenous alike. And so I truly believe that reconciliation isn't about pity, as you said. It's not about um, uh, charity for Indigenous people. Reconciliation is an opportunity for you and I collectively to be a part of healing Canada, right?
Yeah.
To perhaps leave behind the best possible version of Canada for all of our kids. And I think that as we begin to reclaim and rebuild those relationships, that it should have always been in place, that as educators, we may find that we have the opportunity to fill our toolkit with tools that serve this idea of being the best possible teacher to all of our students, to honoring diversity, to being inclusive of every identity. Right? And it's, I think, compelling to note that that idea of serving diversity and being inclusive to diversity stands antithetical to the ideas of colonization that created many of the school systems throughout the country. Sameness was a value that was promoted and demanded of schools. Sameness and conformity, the ability to participate in a growing economy in a useful factory worker kind of way. And that's not the kind of education system we want to nurture for our kids, and not one that's going to be healthy for any part of Canadian society, whether it's economical, whether it's social, whether it's just protecting ourselves from the kind of hatred and divisiveness that we see taking place in other nations, even just south of the border. You
Mhm.
know, I think that inclusive education, reconciliation, that kind of honoring of identity is how we inoculate ourselves from that kind of hatred. Right? And if we think that that kind of hatred couldn't exist here in Canada, I would beg us to reconsider. I truly believe that reconciliation is a pathway to leaving behind a Canada that's safe for all of our kids.
It's interesting because I've known you now for a number of years. Ironically, we met on June 1st, 2015. I don't know if you
Mm,
remember that, but we met
I
at the
do.
University of Ottawa. And then both of us walked over to see the presentation. And I've, since that time, I've gotten more and more involved in learning about Indigenous worldviews and Indigenous education as part of my own journey to reconciliation and to being a better teacher, frankly. And given the world that we're in right now, I was saying to some of my friends that 2 weeks ago was the first time I'd actually received anti-Semitic hate mail.
Mm,
I've received hate mail before about inclusion and, whatever, but now it's being turned into you Jews are trying to control, blah, 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 whatever. And it is very, growing up in a generation that was the children of Holocaust survivors and the grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, and seeing what they lived with and the trauma they lived with, similar to how you have seen the residential school survivors. You and I are in that same kind of position of being that next generation to the trauma. So it's very clear to me, and I've done a number of projects in schools now with kids, looking at things like the role of women, looking at things like LGBTQ, and that Indigenous culture had a much healthier vision in terms of how gay people were seen and treated, in terms of how women were seen and treated. You know, women were the grandmothers' councils. They were seen as, they were held in high esteem. And in terms of how elders, right? We think of them as old people, right? As opposed to elder. And so there's a lot of us, elders, people in the LGBTQ community, et cetera, that would have benefited from British cultures or European cultures adopting Indigenous perspectives rather than the other way around. And I think that's something that the world needs to hear, that actually there's something for us all to benefit from.
You know, you said that in such a lovely way. And I like how you provided the opportunity. I really appreciate how you provided the opportunity for us to, sort of hear each other's stories and be able to recognize the humanity in each other's stories, right? We may not have walked the exact same path, but there's so much in our stories that we can relate to. And I think that as we create the kind of classrooms where we can hear each other's stories, that capacity for empathy can only grow. And there's no room for hatred in empathy. There's no room for prejudice. That's, again, it's the way that we protect our future.